Hey everyone, it's your friend Jason, and I'm back with another episode of Learn with Jason. Today on the show, we're bringing on one of my favorite people in the game, the one and only Chance. How you doing, Chance?
Hey, Jason. Good. How are you?
I'm doing great. I'm so excited to have you on the show. I feel like we've had the chance to work on a couple things in the past, and it's always been fun. And today, you're bringing on something really interesting that I've heard about kind of on the periphery and haven't actually looked into yet. But before we talk about that, let's talk a little bit about you. For folks who aren't familiar with you and your work, do you want to give us a bit of a background?
Sure. Yeah. So my name is Chance. Last name Strickland. Chance Strickland. Chance the dev on the internet, and I am a software engineer. I work at a startup called Replo. We're building a page builder app for Shopify stores to ship landing pages without writing any code. We are also we're just building out we have a really grandiose vision for what this thing's going to be, and it's like our main focus is just improving the e-commerce space for people who don't know how to write code. And so that's kind of what I do in my day job. My history, I think a lot of people on the internet probably know me for some of my work before. I've done a fair bit of open source work. I worked on the Radix UI library for modules. I also, before that, worked on Reach UI. So I have a long history in component libraries and lower level React-based components, a lot of accessibility experience, and really brought those to the table for those two projects, which ended up getting a lot of exposure. Also worked on the Remix core team. So I think I was employee number 3 on that team. So pretty early in helping build out Remix, maintained React Router while I was on that team as well. So a lot of exposure to open source prior to my current job. So that's probably what, if anyone is familiar with me at this point, probably what they know me from. Other than that, I just shit post a lot on Twitter, and just here to hang. Really excited to talk about something somewhat new to me as well, but it's a project that I've been looking at for quite some time, and just really excited to dig in and talk more about it.
Excellent. Yeah, people are excited. What's up, everyone? Thank you for coming in. Snania, what's going on? Nikki, hello. All right, so we're talking about, most of your experience in open source has been around React libraries, right? And so you've done incredible work. Reach UI was so good. I wish I wish it had gotten all the way to fruition because I loved it so much. And I've always loved that you've put such a heavy focus on building things that feel good to use and are also fully accessible. That has been, a common thread through all your work. How did that become something that you were focused on? Because it's clearly something that shows up everywhere you go.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I have a storied history beyond just web development. Web development's like my number 4 career, I think. I'm a serial career switcher. Finally found one that I kind of like and I think I'll stick with for a little while. So, but before that, I have a history and background in design. I studied architecture in college and went on to be not an architect, but a graphic designer. But I've always dabbled with the web. I made websites back in high school and college for bands that I was in at the time. I think that's a pretty common background story from what I can tell from all the developers I've talked to over the years. It's like a lot of overlap between musicians and web developers who, like, unbeknowingly became web developers because their band needed a website and they enjoyed tinkering. So like that's kind of how we did it. And so I've always had that in the background, but I was very design focused early on. And so when I caught wind of design systems and the whole idea of design systems, I was just fascinated. It brought together 2 of my favorite things, design and systems, and how to systematize design in such a way and componentize. Is that a word? We're gonna go with
Works
it.
for me.
We're gonna roll into it, right? Turn these frequently used design patterns into these components, which brought me into React. Before React, I was building a lot of WordPress sites, built a few apps with Laravel. But as far as the design goes, it was mostly just either rolling my own quote unquote systems, which are really just me going in and adding styles everywhere, not really understanding systems at the time. But design systems were fascinating to me, and components were fascinating to me. And those things drew me to React And the more I dug in there and started to get familiar with some of the ecosystem, that's when I stumbled into Reach UI, which at the time was still in its early phases. And they had a few components that I thought looked really, really interesting. Really loved the patterns that they introduced. Um, and, I also kind of wish that Reach UI would have reached its full potential, but in some way, I think it did because it really inspired a new generation of libraries to come after it that
Right.
have sort of adopted and ran with a lot of the patterns that Reach UI, I don't know if I'd say established, but really helped cement into the psyche of how you compose these design components. And
That's an interesting, like, this is kind of a side point, like a little tangent, but the more I've been in this industry and just in general, the less I'm convinced that anybody invents anything, right? Like it
sure,
seems like we're all sort of remixing each other's ideas, riffing on each other's ideas. And the claim isn't necessarily that you invented it. The claim is that you popularized it or that you reintroduced it to a group, as opposed to like this came fully formed out of my brain, which
sure.
I guess is true of like all ideas. But I do think you're right though, that the Reach UI stuff put this sort of thinking on the radar of so many developers who maybe previously had never considered it at all or were even aware that it was a thing they needed to think about.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of the patterns that Reach UI sort of put out into the world were always kind of the intended patterns that the React team had when they, open sourced React in the first place. It was just that
Mm,
we didn't really understand composition to the degree that it how powerful that it truly was. And Reach UI kind of exposed people to that, I think, in a way that really caught on. And
yeah.
that's kind of what I think inspired so many libraries after it, even teams after it, like all these design systems, closed source work that I've done too. I've seen those patterns come up again and again and again. And I've also seen the old patterns come back to bite people so often that
Mm.
it's still really useful to go back and teach and remind people how composition works. And at the end of the day, it all goes back to the core programming model behind React, which I really, really love. Um, and I still think it has so much untapped potential. And one of the reasons that I love Million.js so much is the fact that you have now all of these competing frameworks that talk about performance and how React is slow. And there's some truth to that, but I don't believe you should have to throw the baby out with the bathwater. If you
Hmm.
really do lean into that core programming model that React offers, how can we sort of have the best of both worlds? And I think Million.js is onto something. It's really it struck a nerve, and I think it's going to inspire a lot of people to figure out how we can pull this thing even further.
Absolutely. And can we just get a little bit of props in the chat for how absolutely flawless that segue was?
Thanks. Practicing that. Yeah.
Wonderfully done. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Million.js. The hype on it, like if you look at their site, the headline on Million.js is just make React 70% faster.
Yeah.
What the heck does that mean?
So that's the one that got me interested. So well done to the Million team who decided on running with that. I wish it were that simple, but it is a really good way to get your attention and to get you interested in diving in a little deeper. But fundamentally, what Million is that it's a way to make one particular aspect of React faster, and that is rendering.
Mm,
React is a lot of people are going to say one of two things. They're either going to say React is slow or they're going to say React is fast enough. I don't think anyone out there is really saying React is fast, which I think is unfortunate. I think fast enough is good for a lot of apps, but when it does become a bottleneck, it can be really, really painful to isolate and figure out exactly what those bottlenecks are and to optimize those things. React gives us a lot of tools for this. But for anyone who's gone down the use memo rabbit hole, it's not always that straightforward.
mm,
And not only that, I just think that there's more we can do to keep people from having to truly think about this at such a deep level when they're building highly interactive apps. And so I think having something like Million that we'll talk about what it is, I'm sure, but it really is a compiler that changes how rendering works in React. and it does so in a way that it can, in many cases, vastly improve the rendering performance and the reconciliation performance in React. And
So
so,
go ahead.
I was just going to say, like, so it says make React 70% faster, it doesn't mean it's going to make your React app 70% faster just because you drop it in place, right?
Sure.
There is a lot of nuance to that. There are trade-offs like anything else. Some of the decisions that is made and how it does its rendering is going to impact performance of different components in different ways. And so there is a lot more nuance, and I'm still honestly learning a lot about it. This is I came on here because I tweeted a couple weeks ago that I was really excited about this project, but I still only had a very surface level understanding at the time, and I'm still learning, and we're hopefully going to learn a lot in real time together. But from what I've seen and what I've read so far, I think there's a lot of potential here, and I don't even think Million has reached their own fullest potential yet. So yeah, really excited to dig into the performance thing.
Yeah, and so I think like you're talking about rendering, and rendering in React is kind of a hot topic right now. There's, I think it's been especially a hot topic since the introduction of hooks and the good or bad, depending on your outlook, introduction of use effect. Because I think use effect didn't change the way that rendering worked, but it maybe changed how much we were aware of what was happening in rendering in React. And so the part that, and I'm going to make a statement and then you can tell me if I'm wrong here, but my feeling about it is that what makes rendering in React hard is that there are enough places where you as the developer need to know what's rendering and why, and you have to trace that through different parts of your code base in a way that can be really, really challenging, especially, as you said, as something that's complex. You end up with a situation where you have like, this thing changes. Now that thing has data that will get passed down to lots of other components, all of which have different use effects and things that get triggered. And you have to decide whether or not those components need to re-render when that data gets passed down, and whether the type of data that was changed or like in what way it was changed matters. And so if you're not really, really clear on how that data flow works and how the rendering model in React works, you can very easily accidentally set up some extraordinarily heavy compute in a complex app.
Sure.
So the premise here is that Million is trying to mitigate that in a way that doesn't require us to throw out the programming model of React.
Yeah, absolutely.
Got it. Okay. Well, that's exciting. I'm very interested in that. So, I probably, if I need to do a follow-up episode with the creator of Million.js, who, if I remember correctly, is like a teenager.
It's so nuts. If you like, I had no idea of that, by the way. Like when I first stumbled into it, I mean, it was a really awesome library. But like when I heard the guy was, I think he was like 16, 17 when he started writing it.
Wild.
Absolutely blew my mind. I was like, how is this kid doing work that the core React team and all of their amazing abilities and knowledge, not to talk down the React team. They have a lot of things going on too that they're working on. I mean, there's a lot of good stuff happening behind the scenes that we're not looking at. But just the fact that this kid like just sort of blew past all of that and was like, I'm going to make React faster.
I mean,
what are you doing? Like,
it is always really like, I love just the willingness to believe that you can, right? Like there's this part of me that these days when I look at something like that, I go, there's probably a good reason that they did it that way. And that's enough for me to not bother. And like,
right.
for somebody who still has that optimism, it's like, no, you know what? I believe it can be better. And I don't care if it's hard, I'm going to do it anyways. I mean, that's the kind of stuff that pushes the whole industry forward. So yeah, definitely need to do a follow-up, but let's talk a little bit about what we want to accomplish today. So what did you have in mind?
Yeah, so I really just wanted to build a very simple app that showcases how Million works, at least from the point of view of the developer who is using it. I also wanted to, before we do that, I kind of wanted to start with a demo that the Million team put together. I'm going to try and pull this up. I think it's demo.million.dev. Yeah, that's the one. And so I just want to to start here. And it looks like posting links in the chat is no bueno.
Oh,
So
you
I'm
might
gonna
have to
post
throw it in the private chat and then I
yeah,
can
yeah, yeah.
relay.
No worries. So that's a good rule actually, probably to not let just everyone post links into the chat. It could go bad real fast. Yeah, so this demo, it's just a benchmark demo. It's not like, always keep in mind with these things that this is not reflective of a real world app. This is not going to be one-on-one comparable with your app. This is just a benchmarking tool, and it's useful to provide some insight, but it's not necessarily the indicator that your app is going to work exactly the same way, because there's always trade-offs, right? And so I assume you're doing pretty well for yourself. You're probably running on a pretty high-end machine, if I had to guess.
This is an M1 Max, so I would say that it was once a very high-end machine. I think now it's on the struggle bus.
No, you're doing. The M1s are still pretty fire, so I think you're doing all right. And the reason I ask is because the performance benchmarks we're to be looking at have a lot to do with CPU.
Yes.
And so when we talk about performance in React, obviously there's a lot of different factors. We're not talking about like the rendering performance of like, this has everything to do with how not only React renders, but how the browser is going to render as well. Sorry, I was trying to figure out how to frame that. But so where this is really going to be powerful, I think, is very large apps with lots and lots of data, which will cause bottlenecks on pretty much any system, but more broadly for people who are running on lower end devices. And so if we play, so the demo here is pretty straightforward. We have 3 different tabs. The nodes, that's just the number of nodes that we're rendering in this large table at the bottom, and is a one-to-one just representation of that's how many list items we have, right? Like, so we're rendering 1,000 list items, and then you have options to select how we're going to render those. You can render them just using React out of the box, using regular React state updates. You can see how it performs rendering with React Fiber, which essentially just means the state updates are wrapped in a start transition, which is going to unblock the UI. And then you can see how it all works with Million. And so for anyone who's not familiar with the performance indicator here, the little spinny wheel thing, what that's supposed to represent is blocking. So when a script is executing, it blocks the UI. And so when you see that thing start to slow down and really sputter and turn orange and red, that means that the UI is blocked, essentially. And that's what that's telling us, right? And so if you're just calling set state to update all of these nodes, that's what happens if you click on the React tab, and you'll see. Also, just FYI, because these are vastly different rendering engines, every time you switch tabs, it will take a second for your machine to catch up. So just keep that in mind. With React Fiber, the idea here is that when you wrap an update in start transition, it unblocks the UI, but the update itself for each of the DOM nodes might take a little bit longer. So that's just sort of a trade-off there.
Right.
And then Million is supposed to be somewhere in between and better at both unblocking the UI and updating the UI. It's like, and again, in different scenarios, they might have different performance benchmarks, but we should start to notice a difference especially as we start throttling. Right now, you can play with it. When you press the increment button, that's going to create state updates that updates each one of the nodes in the UI. And so what I'd expect you to see in Million is for the blocking indicator to be relatively smooth. When you press the increment button, I would also expect to see that the UI, both the table of rows and the number in the button itself, should update pretty quickly. And it should be a one-to-one update with a number of clicks. And so if you click really fast 10 times, you should see the number go up by 10. Same thing in the React tab. If you're just rendering without concurrent rendering, you should see the tab does eventually catch up, but it's a little slower to catch up because things are blocked behind the scenes, right? So with the core React rendering, this is kind of the main problem, is when you have a lot of nodes that are being updated, it can block the UI and it can cause this noticeable lag in performance. And so React Fiber, or concurrent rendering, it sort of came about to solve this problem, but it introduced, like I said, some trade-offs. So even though it does unblock the UI faster, if you press the button 10 times, you'll notice it doesn't necessarily update 10 times.
I just tapped it 10 times and we only got to 2. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
Yes. So with a lot of nodes, a lot of those updates don't get scheduled because it's got to unblock that UI, right? So it's sort of like slicing up different parts of work, and it doesn't necessarily capture that because the UI hasn't caught up to React's background rendering. So it's a little bit, it's a trade-off, right? And so but with a lot of data, I would argue this trade-off's almost worse because you're not getting the feedback that you actually expect. With when you have a small amount of data, it's fine, and when you wrap smaller pieces of updates in start transition, you probably never notice these things, and in fact, you might even see an improvement there. But it is a trade-off to be cognizant of, and like I said, Million tries to remove the overhead for both of those, for both blocking and for updating the UI, and so that's kind of like that's the thing that you would be looking for when you are comparing performance in your app between Million and React, right?
Yeah, I'm definitely starting to chug this page.
Yeah, and it'll get really, really noticeable if you open up DevTools. If you open up the Performance tab and you choke your CPU a little bit, you should see.
Oh wait, how does one do this?
It should see CPU throttling. I would go 4x. If you go 6x, nothing's going to happen. So, Million also, if you're throttling your CPU, it doesn't matter what you're using. If you have a low power device, it might take a little bit of time. But if you click on that React tab.
I'm trying.
Yeah, good luck. Yeah. It'll take a second.
Okay, let me get to the React tab.
Yeah. It's a really effective CPU throttle.
It is doing great. Do I need to unthrottle this to get me? Okay.
Is red spinner good? No, red spinner very bad.
Okay, so here we go. We're in the React tab. We're going, I am incrementing.
Look at It's gonna chug. Yeah, it's gonna really chug. And so the UI is blocked for the entirety of that cycle while the spinner stops and it's red. Like that's blocking everything else in the UI. So it can be really bad on low power devices. And again, this example has a lot of data. I also want to throw out there too, a lot of people will say that React is fast enough. What they mean is that it's fast enough for most applications. And I think that is generally pretty true as far as rendering is concerned. For most applications, rendering is not the performance bottleneck. But when it becomes the bottleneck, it can be really, really painful to fix. And so I just want to call that out. Like this is not first of all, this does not mean that your app is going to be this slow. Like we've got 1,000 rows here of DOM updates to perform. And the DOM update itself is a pretty slow process, which is why people do things like virtualization, right?
Right.
So just stuff to keep in mind. And also, this is not a silver bullet either. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we dive into how Million absolutely works.
All right. Well, so before we dive into that, let me do a quick shout out. We've got this episode, like every episode, being closed captioned by, we've got Amanda with us here today from White Coat Captioning. Thank you very much. And that is being made possible through the support of our sponsors. We've got Netlify, Vet2 Code, and just signed up NX. Thank you so much to everyone who has taken the time to sponsor this show. And I also need to do a quick shout out to the new channel members. Signing up to support the channel makes such a huge difference for me. I really do appreciate it. So thank you, Roger, and thank you, Adam, for signing up and becoming members. Really do appreciate that. So, all right, let's dive into.
Can I say something really fast?
Yes.
I've always wanted to say this. I don't have a YouTube channel. I just want to make sure everyone smashes that like and subscribe button. That's all I got. Smash that like, smash that subscribe.
That's right. Ring that bell.
That's right. Get those boops flying, baby.
All right, so let's dig in here. I am very, very excited to learn more about this. So I shared a link to your profile earlier, but for anybody who did not see it, let me share that again. This is Chance on the Twitter. Is there somewhere else that I should send people? It was so obvious a while ago that it was like it should be your Twitter profile, and it's just not that anymore. So.
Right. Yeah, no, it's still kind of the main place I hang out on the internet, but I am also working on a course called Front to Back. Just had a little name drop that, but the link is in the Twitter bio. It's just fronttoback.dev. It's something I started working on about a year and a half ago, but I've really started picking it back up this year, and would love to have people. Essentially, this course is for people like myself, for front end developers who really struggled on the back end or didn't understand the back end for a long time. I've made a lot of strides in that area, and am hoping to share that knowledge. It's not just any other backend course, but it's specifically geared for people who are already competent front end developers, because I think
Mm.
we have a certain way of thinking about web development, and I think there are ways to make these concepts connect better, if you already have that understanding. So that's kind of how I'm focusing this course. And if you fit that description, I'd love to have you along. Um, and so there's a sign up at the bottom. You can sign up and get updates and little mini courses as we start to build this out.
Awesome. So go check that out, because I feel like this is one of those things, like learning a little bit of backend as a front end dev it's such a superpower, because all
Absolutely.
of a sudden any of those ideas that you have, you can just build them. And
Yep.
that feels really, really good.
Yeah, and
All right.
even if you don't want to build those things, if you're just on a team and you're looking to up your career game, like you're
Mm-hmm.
going to fit in so much better with any team, even as a front end developer, if you can jump into the other side confidently and really understand how things work. So yeah, I think there's just a lot of benefits to that.
Yeah, and this is sort of that, like I talk about being a generalist a lot, and having a broad set of skills, or what I've heard described as a paint drip developer, where you have broad experience in like varying levels of depth in different topics. It means you can jump into any part of any project and be high contributing.
Hmm.
And that's going to have so many good things for your career, for your ability to get the job you want. And from a standpoint of, like, I always make the joke that a career is a pie eating contest where the prize for winning is more pie. So if you want to be doing something, do that thing, and people will reward you by having you do more of that thing, right? So that broad base of experience allows you to direct yourself a little bit more by being able to do the things that you wish people would hire you to do.
And now I want pie. Didn't have that hankering before, but yeah, kind of want some pie.
All right, so let's dig in here. So we've got the Million.js site. Let me toss this
Yeah,
into the chat for everyone. And I am ready. I'm excited.
let's do it.
I want to give this a shot. So what should I do first?
All right. So just a little bit of background. Million is a compiler first and foremost. And so because it changes fundamentally how React works, it needs to have a little bit more knowledge into the overall application that you write. And so the only way that it can really do its optimizations correctly is by digging into the compiler and acting as sort of a complete rethinking of how React works. Like you shouldn't, if you use Million, you shouldn't have to change anything about the code you write in most cases. You should just be able to set up the compiler and go. And so they have a way to do that, which we're going to use Vite, although it has ways to plug into different compilers. If you go to the
Okay.
docs, you'll see there's like a getting started section
Oh, whoops. Let me actually get
or
to the docs
introduction.
here.
And
Docs.
then, yeah, so we can just skip the intro and go right to installation. And so you'll have a few things, but so the first thing we're going to do is we need to set up a project. So
All right. So
we're going to use Vite.
I had something open here. So let me. Yeah, what do? We do npm
I
create
think it's
Vite.
create. Yeah, that sounds right. And then I would say at latest, just to be sure you don't have a cache thing hanging around, and it's going to ask you a bunch of stuff. So just go ahead and go
Okay.
through the prompts. I think it should ask you a template, and you can use React or React TS, whatever you prefer.
So we want
Yeah, just go
React,
React.
we
Yeah.
want TypeScript. Okay. So let me open this up, and all right.
Right on. So I would also go ahead and just install your dependencies so we can spin this thing up.
Okay. And if you've never seen a Vite project before, they keep it pretty simple. So you've got the standard entry file, you've got an app file that has just some demo stuff showing like how use state works, little bit of styles, some global styles, and then we've got a logo here, and everything else is kind of not super relevant to what we're working on today. So ultimately, I'm guessing we're probably going to dump most of what's here. But
Yeah.
all right, did you want me to start this?
Before you do, go ahead and let's go ahead and just do the install real quick of Million. So just npm install Million.
Okay. And now I'm just going to keep this open so we can see what we're doing. So there's Million.
And before you start it up, go into the Vite config, because like I said, this is a compiler, so we need to make sure that we integrate it with Vite. And you're going to import Million from million/compiler. And then in the plugins, we're right before the React plugin, we're going to initiate the the Million plugin. So this will be million.vite, and this is going to be a function. And then that function is going to take some arguments as an object. And so you have two modes you can use here. You have auto, and you have manual. And so there's an auto key. So just go ahead and set, for now, let's just set that to true. And this is how the Million docs recommend you get started with Million, is just set it to auto mode. And now we should be able to save this and run our app, and everything should just work the same way it would have worked without it, right?
And it does.
And so you're not going to see anything different. This is obviously a very, very small app without a lot of data, so you're not going to really notice anything different. But I just want to illustrate that it just works, right? It's a drop-in, essentially a drop-in replacement for what React was already doing under the hood, and everything should just work most of the time. I think they made a lot of really interesting changes in the latest version in V3. I know with server-side rendering in particular, there were some issues with older versions of Million that they made lots of improvements on. So ideally, there should be a large degree of compatibility with the larger React ecosystem as of version 3. So I think, and I don't quote me on this because I haven't benchmarked every React app in the world, but it should work for most React apps as just a drop-in doing something like this. That said, I have no idea how auto mode actually works. There's a bunch of different things you can use to, a few different things you can pass in here to help configure it. There's like a threshold prop that I don't actually know how it works. So, and I think that's the idea. They don't want you to have to think too hard about how it works. They want you to understand at a high level how it works and what the trade-offs are for using Million to handle rendering for a component versus React's core rendering engine. But if you understand those, you shouldn't have to do too much configuration to make auto mode work pretty well for your application. And so essentially what's happening here when you're running in auto is your components are going to be optimized. The rendering of those components are going to be optimized by Million, and you shouldn't have to think about it. But in some cases, there are cases, and the Million docs, I think, do a pretty good job of diving into the nuance here, where there are some components, depending on the data, where Million actually might be slower. And so in those cases, you might have a component where you have a lot of data that changes between render cycles, and that could slow down Million. And in that case, you might want to bail and use React's core rendering. You can do that with a comment at the top of the component. It's just //million-ignore, very similar to a prettier ignore line. And Million, since it's a compiler, it sees that, and it will completely ignore that component and not optimize it for you. And it lets React do what it always would have done in that case. So it's sort of like a reverse, like an opt-out if you're in auto mode, right?
Okay.
And someone asked of when Million could be slower. So to understand this, I think it's helpful to understand some of the, I don't want to get too in the weeds about how the rendering differences work, but essentially when React renders your application, what it does is it goes through and when data changes, when state changes, it is going to re-render your not the entire tree, but it's going to re-render the parts of your tree that have changed, or the parts of the tree that depend on the data that has changed. And then it's going to go through a process of reconciliation where it reconciles the difference between those components in the tree. And that, I think, is really where things start to slow down in React, or they can start to slow down in React. Because it's not just diffing the data that has changed, it's diffing the entire tree. And so Million takes a slightly different approach. it doesn't diff the entire tree, it diffs the data. It's a compiler, so it can see into your components. It understands where that data is being used. And instead of diffing the entire tree, it just diffs the data.
Mm.
And in doing so, it can be more hyper-focused as to which things that it has to update throughout the tree. I think Svelte might do something similar. I think they call it like dirty diffing or dirty checking or something.
Dirty checking sounds right.
Yeah, so it's not diffing the entire tree, it's only diffing the data. So when can Million be slower? Well, if the bottleneck in a component is the data and not the tree, then in that particular case, Million might be slower because it's diffing that data instead of the tree. So if you have a really high compute piece of data that's wrapped in use memo because it's expensive and that piece of data updates and Million has to diff that in that process, it could technically be slower. Always, always, always profile these things before you make assumptions. But
Right.
that's kind of the idea, is that because it's not diffing the tree, it's diffing the data. Where's the bottleneck in your component? If it's the data, Million might not be the best for that component.
And I also think that the scenario that you're talking about where, the issue is the data, I think that is one of those things that I consider to be it's like a core architectural thing, is trying not to put intensive data into the front end. Like your JavaScript probably shouldn't be doing big computed data calls anyways, right? Like, if it is, maybe consider trying to move that somewhere else, move it to an API, move it to something else. Because if what you're always doing is getting back the same derived data, you're making a lot of people's browsers do that work instead of having one centralized server doing that work. And so like a serverless function with a great cache on it is going to be a really good way to solve that problem, for example. Obviously there are exceptions like dashboards where the data is per user. But even then you can still put that like on a server that's right, on US East 2, right next to the database where it's pulling the data from, and you're probably going to have a better time than making the user's browser deal with that.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, and I think one that we really have to hammer home when we talk about this. And you talk about performance by any metric in React or any other framework. There are so many pieces to this puzzle. It's not a silver bullet. Million's not a silver bullet. Moving your data to the server is not a silver bullet. None of these things are necessarily going to result in better performance. There's always trade-offs, and you always have to be measuring. And so it just knowing how these things work at a high level gives you a really good head start when things start to get slow as to where you need to look to fix them. And so you're absolutely correct. If you can remove some of that compute from the user's computer to the server or to a serverless function, that could very well improve performance more than moving to Million would. But it really just depends on what you need and what you're building. And so, yeah, I think that's a great point. So I was just going to jump into. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
There were a couple questions that I wanted to pull up here. So the first one was, is there a restriction to use it? It looks like there is not, because they've got docs here for Next, Astro, Gatsby, Vite, Remix, Create React App, Webpack, and Rollup, which I believe covers
like everything, right?
That's the gamut, I think. And because they have a Vite setup, I think anything that's not listed here is probably running on Vite. So you should be in pretty solid shape wherever you want to use it. And then the other question was about, and then you can opt out. Yes, you can opt out. So they have options like you were just saying, they have the Million ignore, like a TS ignore, as well as you have this just straight up skip where you can tell it to skip different components. Like if it's using a certain thing, you can skip that whole component. So this would be a way to sort of get, however you want to do it. So there's the Million ignore. Lots of options here, very configurable. So right out of the gate, this sounds pretty promising. But as you said, no, like a quote that I love from SneelPie is, I'm being told that silver bullet only seem to work on werewolf-shaped problems.
I love that. Yeah.
And so yeah, it's very much like none of this stuff, no piece of code, no framework, no tool is going to replace the critical thinking that goes into looking at how your particular app serves your particular set of users and making sure that the way that you're putting things together is getting them the best possible result. And you just can't automate that. That has to be a process of you thinking through how do things move, where's the work done, where's the, where are the places where we could do less work or combine work or any of those things. That's the job. Like, our job is not to write code. Our job is to make the computers do things in the best way, right? Code is only a small part of that. Most of it is thinking.
Absolutely. Which is why I think our jobs are safe as far as AI is concerned, at least for the moment, because
yes,
still not great at actually thinking, but
100%. But so, okay, we've got, I mean, this might just be a really short demo. We're done.
We're not done. No, we're not done. We're not done. Thankfully, there's more. I mean, I thought about that actually when you suggested this. I was like, it's pretty easy. Like, it might take 10 minutes. But I do want to dive in a little bit because there's, this is, like I said, this is automatic mode. But if you flip auto to false, we have now entered manual mode, which, as the name suggests, means that you have to do more manual work to get things. And so this is where I've dived in a bit more, just because magic to me is kind of confusing. So I like to try to at least understand at a high level how certain things work. And so the main difference between auto and manual is that instead of opting out of million optimizations, you now get to opt into million optimizations. So manual.
We're still running. The server restarted. I come back out here. We're in manual mode, but now this is all running in React's compiler.
Exactly. Yeah, React is still doing all the rendering now because we have opted out of manual mode, or opted into manual mode or out of auto mode. And what that means is now if you want to optimize anything in your app, you need to do so manually with some of Million's tools that they provide. And there are only a few tools. Essentially, at a high level, what Million does is it gives you this concept of a block. And so each component, when you're in auto mode, the components that are optimized get converted into what Million calls a block. And it's basically like a React component that is hyper optimized for rendering speed, right? And so while automatic mode gives you these by default, you don't have to think about it. In manual mode, you do, and you do so with this higher order component function called block. And it's very much like React Memo. You just wrap your component in this block function, and it's going to give you, instead of the actual underlying React renderer, it's going to give you a component that is going to be rendered by Million. And so this is the opt-in to Million, essentially, at the component level. And so if you had a component that we wanted to, let's go ahead and create a couple things, because I want to actually create some components where this might be useful. So in your app,
like empty this out, or?
Oh no, you can keep it for now. We're just gonna we're gonna create a new file. Just call it, I don't know, call it table. We'll do like the Million demo. We'll just make a little table with a bunch of rows. And you can go ahead and create a component. We'll call it we'll call it table. And inside the component, let's go ahead and create some state.
Okay.
Or you can return anything to it. It's not a. We just want to create some state, and we'll just say in this particular case we're going to just be adding rows, right? So go ahead and initialize this. Let's say rows, and let's start with like 100 rows.
Okay. And how do you want to do that?
Like initialize your state with 100.
Okay.
And then return here. Let's just return just wrap it in a div, and we'll say. So instead of rendering the table here, what I want to actually do is I want to use this, and maybe table was a bad name, but whatever. We're just YOLO in here. But let's go ahead and say, how do we want to do this? Well, because what I want to do is I want to utilize suspense a little bit, because suspense is going to help us managing the unblocking of the UI while this thing is updating. So before we finish this, let's go ahead and create another component. And because I did a poor job of naming this one, let's call this one actual table.
Okay.
I never said I was good at naming things. So in this particular table, This, again, we're going to make an actual table. So you can return a table element. And just give it like a header with, we'll just say like we'll just have 2 random headings.
How does this work? Yeah. Wait, no, that's not it. TD? Oh God, can I do this?
TH in the T head.
Ah, damn it. Okay. All right. Okay. So
I didn't, no, we can teach HTML too. It's fine. There you go.
Hey, I remembered that a T head existed. I'm going to take the win.
Yeah.
And so then for each of these, we'll have a TD,
There you go.
and that's
Yeah,
going to
there you
be
go.
like thing, and then we'll have a value of like
Yep.
whatever. And I assume this is going to be looped on the rows.
Yep. So you can go ahead and say we're going to take just a set of props, and we'll say one of the props we'll say rows, and it's just the number of rows. And this can be like the actual thing can be randomized. Like it doesn't really matter what we render. So we can just even create like a random array of rows, or if you wanted to install Faker or something to come up with like some names or something, you could do that. But we can, let's just say like math dot, like for each one of the rows, we'll just say like math dot random times the index or whatever, and just put that into value.
Okay.
And the name could be whatever you want it to be.
All right. So this one is going to be thing. We'll just straight up throw the index in, and that's easy enough if I can remember how to type. And then this one, we were going to do math, not F math. I got to turn off all these extra helpers. They're helping too much. So math.random times
0.5. Or it could just be math.random. Doesn't even matter.
Yeah, why not? Let's just do math.random. That's easy enough. And somewhere in here, I messed things up. We're not going to use this row, so we can just skip that part. And now what are you mad at? Property map does not exist. Oh, right, because that's going to be...
Rows is not typed. Yeah, it needs to be an array of numbers. And so, yeah, also V has gotten very aggressive with its linting, so you don't have to pay too much attention. But you did forget a key, so we can go ahead and throw a key on the TR, because you will get a lint error from that. Index is fine, even though that's what it would use by default if you didn't have one. But we can just use the index in this particular case. Yeah.
And I just add these little prefixes because theoretically I would be putting something else that would loop, and if it's all indexed, then you'd get the same index.
Yeah. And with actual data, you would have like an ID or something, and you would use that, because the whole point of the key is so that to prevent React from having to diff the entire tree if nothing changes. So yeah, so now we've got our table, and let's see, we can also, let's go back into our other component. Now we'll actually use this thing. And what I want to do here is, because when we get this thing, when we actually start doing some heavy lifting with this thing, instead of just importing actual table, let's do a lazy import using react.lazy.
Okay. I have never actually used this. Do you want to tell me how it works?
Sure, yeah. So import lazy from React. And what we're doing is we're lazy loading this component. So the component, it's like code splitting, right? Like, so when you lazy load a component, it's not going to load until the parent component that actually has to render it is rendered. And so it prevents you from bringing in extremely large bundles, potentially. It also can help. And so you want to move this out of the component, actually.
You do move it out of the component. Yep. Okay.
And it needs to be a default export. This is one of the things about React Lazy I don't actually like, because I hate default exports. But
it has to be like,
well,
okay.
If you, so I'll show you the workaround real quick. But so inside lazy load, we're going to do there's a function, and that function is going to return an import statement or an import function. So we are lazily importing this thing. So go ahead and import it. And since you don't have a default export here, what you can do is, since this is a promise, you can say .then, and then actually what you're going to return is an object here. Oh, sorry, then is going to take a function. Yep, there you go. And just return an object where the default key says actual table. This is a dumb little thing you kind of have to do because React Lazy expects
Oh, like
lazy.
this.
Yeah, it just expects an object with a default, which is how a default export would play out. So,
What am I
yeah,
doing wrong here?
who knows? Let's see, import then.
Let me get this to wrap so that we can actually see what's going on.
Oh, it's because you haven't used it, which is why I think. Wait, maybe
declared, but its value is never used. Declaration or
oh yeah, it's not wrapped in. Yeah, I gotta wrap it in parens. Yeah.
Okay, and then you're mad because what?
Because you have an extra
default
parens.
is missing.
Sorry, you got an extra parens after the import, and you need to move that parens because you're calling .then on lazy instead of the promise, and so now you need an extra. There you go.
We did it.
Yeah, all dumb because it should have just. I mean, it could have. This is fine. I don't like this default exports, and so I end up doing this a lot. But it would be.
Oh wait,
easier.
hold on. We did.
Yeah, sorry, we're not quite done. We're not quite done.
We also messed this up because we were setting a number here, and then we were expecting this to be an array.
We can fix that in a second.
Okay.
Yeah, leave that as it is. So now you have the actual go into. So another feature when you are rendering components that are lazy imported like this, you need to wrap them in suspense with a fallback because since they're lazy, they're not going to be available immediately. The component needs to render first and deal with that rendering. And so inside suspense, we can render a fallback. And that can just be some text that says loading if we want for now. And now it should be fine. So let's go back to the actual table and fix this problem. We don't need to make this an array. Instead, we can just have like create like an empty array basically out of this. So you can call like array.from length rows, right?
Okay, yeah. So we'll do it like this, and we'll do array from rows. Wait, that doesn't work.
No, it's array. So that has to be an object where it says length.
Length.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I've done this before. Okay.
Yeah. Nice little trick for those who aren't familiar. But essentially, because arrays have a length property, when you create an array from that, it's going to create an empty array with that length. So now we can map through that array instead, and now all of our types should be happy.
Yeah. Good. Okay.
Cool.
So, should we just we can get to that in a minute?
Yeah, we'll get to that in a minute. And so just go ahead and now that we have all this set up, let's render our table in our app.
Okay, so I'm just going to throw it right at the top.
Yeah, and you can get rid of all the other crap at this point if you want. Oh, sorry, you want to import the table, not the actual table. I know this is not confusing at all. From table. Boom.
Everything's happy. We're going back.
Good work.
Here, and look at it go. We've got 100 rows.
Look at all those rows, and look at how freaking slow it's going to be, potentially. It's not that slow right now. We only have 100. If you change that to 1,000, might be a different story. Let's go into our table component real quick and just add a little button that's going to increment that by, let's say, 10.
Okay, so this will be a... I guess we can actually just do the
just throw it on top, above suspense, yeah.
Button, and that'll be an on-click, and that will set rows current plus equals 10. I guess we don't need to do plus equals.
Yeah,
it would just be
yeah, exactly.
You don't implicitly have.
What is it saying?
Oh, it's because I haven't declared this yet. It was just not not remembering how things work, because why would it? Let's see, add 10.
Beautiful.
Okay.
And everything's going to re-render because we're calling math.random in there, right?
Right.
So yeah, just something to keep in mind. All right, so now we have this this table, and let's just click add 10 like a bunch more times. Or actually, Oh man, I was gonna say create like a Fibonacci function or something, so this thing gets super, super slow. But let's just
If that crashes my browser, the whole
there
stream
you go.
ends. So we probably shouldn't do that.
Yeah, exactly. Make it. I've made that mistake before. Let's say make it at 100 because I want to see it really start to
Okay.
jug here.
And we're going to add 100.
There you go. And so just keep pressing that button. You should start to
see it chugging.
See it feel pretty laggy at a certain point.
Yeah,
right?
that's a mess.
Yeah.
So we're now at, let's see how many. Yeah, 4,000 roughly. And now when I click, watch it chug.
There you go.
Like there's a notable delay when I'm doing this now. It feels this is janky.
Yeah. So what we're going to do now is we're going to use Million. And so let's go ahead and open up so we've got the table already. What we want here is the actual table. We want to make some changes to the actual table. And so what we're going to do here, so we're going to take, so the expensive stuff are all of these rows that we're rendering, right? So let's extract all of that. Not let's keep that where it is, but just take the TR element. We're going to create a new component for this.
Okay.
And go ahead and at the top, anywhere, just outside of the component here, go ahead and create a new one, call it row. And then, just return the thing that we had.
Okay, and that's just going to need one of these for now.
Yeah, you don't need, no, sorry, you don't need a key. You remember you pass the key once you iterate, so we don't need the key here. You can just get rid of that.
We don't need the thing, but so we'll still need the name.
Just call it name and then call it value.
Okay, and then do you want these to, like, we don't want to calculate this inside anymore?
Correct.
Do we want to pass it in?
Yep, just pass it in. Pass that as the value.
Okay, so name value. And value is going to be, we'll just make it a number.
It doesn't matter. Yeah, any number, string,
all right.
Whatever.
And then this will be value. This will be the name. And this will be our component. So then we've got our row. And down here, we will say row key equals I. And then we need the name.
Mm-hmm.
Which will be this, and the value, which will be this. Okay, then we can drop this.
Yep. And right now we haven't changed anything, right? Like we've just moved this to a separate component. We're still rendering it exactly the same.
Right. And so
what we want to do is we want to use Million to handle this for us so that things start to get faster. Remember that the primary reason that React gets so slow here is because you're handling a ton of DOM nodes, and the DOM updates themselves are going to take a long time, but you're also handling a ton of React nodes in the React tree. And for React to deal with this, it needs to go through and actually, again, it has to diff all of those nodes. And as you have more nodes, there's just a certain point where you just add work for the browser to do.
Right.
And again, we don't necessarily want to diff the nodes. We only need to diff the data. So we can use Million for something like this. And what we're going to do is with our row, we're going to do a couple things. But the first thing we're going to do is we're going to wrap it in the higher order function block that we import from Million.
Okay, so we're going to, sorry, I was answering a question in the chat. I'm going to import block.
Yep, from Million/React.
From Million/React.
Yep.
Okay.
And wrap our row in a block function. And you have now opted into rendering this row with Million. However, we're not quite done. Million has another tool that we get for handling large lists called for. It's capital F4 that you can import as well from Million. And this is a component.
Okay.
And this is essentially a component that Million gives you to handle large lists of data or large lists of blocks, rather.
So is anytime this you have like a control flow function?
Yeah, kind of. Yeah.
Okay.
If you're used to, I think Solid has similar functions. So if you're used to that sort of thing, it's going to work very similarly. So you're going to you're going to render 4. and you're going to pass in the data. So I think it's for each, I want to say, is the prop name.
For each array.
And you're going to pass in array. And then inside of, so the children is actually going to be just a function. So it's a render prop essentially. And it's going to give you the item.
So basically the same.
No index, just the item.
Just the item.
Yep. And so actually what I think we want here is I think we need, let me see here. I had some notes on this. I think the math.random thing, we need to extract that out a little bit too. So the actual array of data that we want, we need to pull up that array and actually create an array of random numbers. So instead of just an empty array, we need to fill it with random numbers. So I think you can call fill.
Fill.
Or map. Yeah, no, map also totally works.
Fill value, and we would just do math.random?
Yeah, I don't think that's going to work because that's going to generate the same random number for every item. We want each one to be different. So actually, let's just use map. There you go. So now each item is actually an array because now it's our array of data. And so each item in that function is the random number. And you don't need the key in this case. You can go ahead and pull that out because we're not actually looping through anything. That's going to be handled under the hood for us.
Okay.
So we should be able to, get rid of that. And just, exactly. And same thing with thing. It just needs to be thing item.
Okay. And then drop this out. Oh, it can be thing.
Yeah, or you can, when you map through, you could also just make it an object that has the index if you wanted to maintain the same.
Fine. It's fine.
It doesn't really matter. Yeah, they can be the same.
Okay.
Great. And now you have optimized this rendering with Million. And so it will still eventually feel laggy because all things do as you add data, but it should feel noticeably less laggy than it did before, because it's not having to do all of the diffing of the entire tree. It's only diffing the data, and the data in this case are just numbers.
Right. Yeah. So this definitely feels like I don't know how many. I think we're at about 5,000 again.
Yeah, we could probably like log it or render it somewhere just so that we know.
Yeah. Maybe what we should do is
put like
let's actually do the thing. Yeah. So we'll set up a count will be I plus 1 and value. And then down here, we can do a thing item.count, and this will be item.value. Okay, so then we can add a bunch. It's going along just nice and easy. 5,600. So
oh wow, that's a lot.
Yeah, we're up at, and like I can feel it chugging a little bit.
Well, 5,000 things in the DOM is going to be slow no matter what you do. Like that's the DOM. So
and it's just kind of like, you know, if you running a loop 5,000 times it is what it is. There's only so much you can do there.
Yeah.
And so this is where you'd start looking, if you have 5,000 items, you'd start looking into virtualized lists or you know, things like that. But the fact that this, and it does feel, I mean, this is something you'd have to try on your own to actually feel it, but it is still chuggy at 5,000, but it is notably less so than plain React. So that's very interesting.
Yeah, I'd say if you ever have 5,000 rows, we're doing something way wrong if
we've
rendering
made
actual
mistakes.
DOM elements. Yeah.
Because also this just sucks to use. Like this would be awful as a
user even when you're not rendering, you have to scroll, and it's like the browser still has to catch up with all that, and it's just at a certain point the browser becomes the bottleneck. So, but yeah, if you started over and just started with 1,000, it should be relatively quick.
Great. Okay, so let's start it over. There's 100. And we go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and it's like instantaneous. Feels really, it feels good. Like this does actually feel like a notable improvement in terms of what it feels like for me as the user to work with this website that's doing a lot of intense work.
Yeah, and there's a couple of different interactions I like to use for testing this sort of thing. One, you want to actually look at the UI update because that's going to be an immediate visual sign that things are happening or things are lagging. But that's going to measure the UI update, but it's not necessarily going to tell you about render blocking. And
Mm,
so something I like to do, like obviously actual profiling is helpful, but just as a little shortcut, like when you click an update, try and like immediately scroll after that because that's going to show you like if the scroll jumps around while it's rendering, that's going to show you UI blocking in action. Um, so if you can scroll pretty much immediately after you've clicked that button, the blocking should be okay. As soon as
right.
that scroll starts to feel really laggy after pressing a button, then you know things are being blocked. And there's
And
other ways to
so,
do this too, but like that's just like
but
a really quick and dirty shortcut that I like to
it
use.
is. So let me add, I'm going to add like another, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. That's another 1,000 items. And like, do you see how, I don't know if this is coming through on the screen, but you can kind of see that like when I go, it starts to jag a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
But we're at, for it to get there, we got to about 2,000. I think 1,500 was when it started. But right out of the gate, like as fast as I can go, there's no hang, and we're at 600 items. So it does, yeah. I think the render blocking thing is huge. And I saw somebody was talking about this on Twitter, I think yesterday, where they were saying that their partner was trying to use a website and they thought it was broken because there was a button, and they would open the web page, they would try to click the button and the button wouldn't do anything, but they
Sure.
had to wait like 8 seconds or something for the page to become interactive.
Right.
And they
Yeah.
didn't know that because why would you know that? And so they kept thinking the site was broken and they would refresh. And so they never got to an interactive page. So this is really interesting to me when you talk about it from that standpoint, because a lot of times we're thinking about how can I get UI on screen as fast as possible? How can I, how can I make the JavaScript as fast as possible? But we're not thinking about how that fits together in the end user experience. And render blocking and interactivity and stuff like that, that's what actually matters on a website. Because if we deliver a beautiful UI that's not interactive, the site feels very broken. Whereas if you deliver a site that shows a loading spinner for a second and then as soon as everything pops in, it's clickable, is that ideal? Probably not. But does it
Depends
ever
on
feel
what you're
broken?
building.
No.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. So yeah, definitely something to keep in mind as you're building is like the way we measure speed matters.
Absolutely. Yeah. And also just to reiterate all this, like there are many ways to optimize your React components. Rendering is just but one of them. And there are even probably better ways to optimize rendering before you get to the point where you need to rip out your compiler. But the idea behind Million that I think is so powerful is that it is something you can just drop in and start adding these little optimizations as you need them. Or you can drop it in, put it on auto mode, and then opt out of things that where you figure out that things are actually slower or worse potentially. It's a very flexible system, and it shouldn't make you change the way you think about writing your code, which is
Mhm.
really what I'm after at the end of the day. Is something that doesn't get rid of the React programming model that I love, but lets me write faster applications. And so if Million can do that for us, I'm in love with it. And it can help, but it's not the only thing. Like you said, you can move a lot of the compute off the machine and onto a server potentially, or onto in a serverless function. There's different ways you can optimize different things, but having this as a tool in your toolkit, I think is really, really powerful. And I don't think it's the last of its kind. I'm really excited to see, like we've all been waiting for React for Git, which itself is going to be a compiler. And I'm sure it will have lots and lots of performance optimizations that we'll get to experience and enjoy. So I think this is just kind of like it's like an opening shot to a call to arms to make React faster.
And I
And
think
I'm really excited about it.
to me, this is the sort of thing that I don't ever want to imply that anybody's like doing anything wrong. So take this with with the spirit of love that it's intended in. In open source, the thing that tends to dictate whether or not a community is thriving, in my opinion, is whether or not people are challenging the space. And what I mean by that
Absolutely
is
agree.
we saw this explosion of innovation around the time that like jQuery came out. There was jQuery, there was MooTools, there was so many other things that came out that were trying to solve that same thing, and they all pushed each other forward. They borrowed the best ideas, and eventually we settled on, okay, jQuery is the best we're going to get for this iteration. So we decided that was the one that won. We adopted all the best parts of that into the browser, and then we had this moment of quiet. And then there was the explosion of Backbone to Angular to React to Svelte and Vue and all these others that came out and like really, another big change of the space. And then it sort of felt like over the last couple of years or the last, 5 years or so, we had just sort of given up and said like, well, React is as good as we're going to do. And I know that anybody who's a Vue main or a Svelte main or an Angular main is like mad that I just said that. And I don't mean that to say that like nothing else mattered, but there was this sort of like a tacit decision that like React was okay. Right. And now that we're seeing this innovation come in and we're seeing people challenge it, like, hey, what if Preact like forks away from React as opposed to being a lighter version of it? What if Million replaces the compiler entirely? What if we don't need any of the React compiler stuff at all and we can just rely on something like Astro? All of a sudden, there's this really interesting challenge to the ideas and to the space to say, I think it could be better. And I think that's going to lead to the React team building far and away better code because they're seeing what people don't like, and not only what they don't like, but how they would rather see it done in a way that allows them to like weigh those trade-offs and make decisions that will ultimately lead to everybody getting better experiences as they build, regardless of whether you stick with Million or whether the best parts of Million get adopted into React Forget, or whether all of that turns into another third thing that we haven't heard about yet.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Like everything is a rising tide that lifts all boats. I'm just like React made, I think, Angular stronger. I think the advent of things like Svelte and Vue and eventually Solid are are going to continue to make React stronger. I think the React team itself is working on solutions that we don't even know exist yet with React Forget, and hopefully some other secrets cooking in the lab over at Facebook. So I think this is just a really beneficial, just the fact that we're thinking more about like core performance.
Mm-hmm.
Because I don't know if you've noticed, the internet is kind of bad. Like we've kind of built a bad internet in a lot of ways. Like like every day I have to use banking apps. I have to use like all of these SaaS services, all of these things that I have to use either for work or for personal use. It's like, it kind of sucks, honestly. And like we can do so much better. And some of that is going to require us thinking very purposefully about the code that we write, but a lot of it doesn't have to. Like a lot of that we can offload onto compilers and tools and things that can just like give us the DX that we love and the mental models that we love. But it's gonna, like, I think stuff like this is great because it takes a lot of that off of our immediate purview and puts that into something like the compile tool. And I think this is really powerful. And I'm just really excited to see, honestly, I'm just really excited to get a better internet because websites suck and I'm tired of using shitty websites. So let's build better websites. There's so many great tools we can use to do that. Million is but one thing in the toolbox. And I really encourage people to dive deep, if you haven't already, into the world of performance optimization, whether you're using React, Solid, you're just YOLOing with web components, whatever you're doing, think about performance. And if you think about performance and you measure performance and you get an idea of like why these things are slow, then you start to realize that maybe they could be better. You just have to think about it. And I think that's just the secret code at the end of the day. Think about it and spend a lot of time understanding it. And from there, you're just going to build better stuff all the way around.
Yeah, and I think the thing that I am most excited about is that it feels to me that, in the same way that we used to have big conversations about mystery meat navigation. I don't know if anybody but me is old enough to remember that section of the internet. But there were these big conversations about like, don't hide your buttons, don't make the nav hard to find, whatever. And we sort of converged on a like standard for what a lot of the components should be. And the way that we approach that led to things are more predictable. You kind of know there's going to be a hamburger nav. You kind of know things are going to be at the top or the left most of the time. You kind of know what a button looks like. And most of the time, those things hold true.
Sure.
That wasn't the case 20 years ago. People were just making all this stuff up as they go along. What I'm excited about is it feels like we've hit critical mass for what a JavaScript-powered app can be. And we're starting to see consensus, not necessarily in implementation, but in measurement of like, how do we make this good? You know, we've got stuff like the Core Web Vitals coming out. Time to interactive is a big deal. And we're starting to accept that like, it doesn't really matter what the developer experience is if the user experience is terrible. And that is leading to the library authors and the framework authors really focusing down on improving those metrics, like make it good for the users and hopefully don't damage the developer experience along the way. And I think that is the sort of focus at the base level that we need so that we as individual developers, when we're focusing on making something really good for our users, we don't have to understand the entire science of the browser to make this work, right? We don't need a master's degree in computer science to build a good website. We can do it by using the defaults because the frameworks are giving us good defaults. I mean, I think this is one of the things that's so exciting about stuff like if you ship a Preact site, you're shipping a good experience by default. You ship Astro or Quick, it's a good experience by default. And hopefully that will become more true about frameworks like Next and others where it's not necessarily true by default, but you can do it with a little bit of work. I think they're putting the effort in to make it so that it will be good by default. So yes, like as developers, we can never stop learning. We can never stop expanding our own understanding of how to make these things better. But also we should be putting pressure on the people who build the tools to make good decisions by, make decisions that are good for the users and make sure that those decisions are baked into the framework as defaults. And it's really interesting to see. I don't know. It feels like we're going that way again.
Yeah, I preach. That's all I can say. I'm just really excited that we're thinking about it. Someone asked about suggested for learning resources. I was going to say web.dev is great. Like there's so much good content on web.dev around performance, around just everything really, as far as like how, like if you wanted to get into the weeds about how the browser works and how it optimizes in its own right, I think that's a really great start. The React docs have added some performance documentation too if you are building on React. So there's a lot of good stuff there. Probably the biggest recommendation I can make is learning how your dev tools performance tools work. That was something I didn't really understand for a long time, but the network tab and the performance tab are highly, highly underutilized for measuring core performance.
Where should somebody go for that?
The Chrome, I think web.dev even has some documentation on this. I don't have anything off the top of my head, but let me see if I can find something.
Let's see if there's, it does look like there's some DevTool stuff on the Chrome.
Yeah, they should have some docs.
I feel like there are people who are really good at using them, but I don't know if they've written up a lot of like how to use them. Does Harry Roberts have DevTool stuff?
Okay, so there is a blog article on the Chrome for Developers blog called Analyze Runtime Performance. And this one appears to dive into the performance tab. So I think that might be a good place to start. Again, I'm sorry, I wish I had these at the ready, but I would say probably everything you're going to need to know on the dev tools are in the dev tools themselves. If you just play with them and I think some of it's pretty intuitive. Even you can sort of play around and figure out how it works. But as you start to see these like really complex flame graphs and charts and things, that's where you're probably going to need to dig into the docs a bit.
Absolutely, yeah. And like, don't get overwhelmed by this stuff because there are a million things that it can do. And the first time you see something like this, your instinct may be to run away screaming, because I know that's what mine was. But ultimately, a lot of this information is useful if you're looking for it, but you can kind of ignore it to look for other key things to see what's happening. And so looking at a page like this, that'll kind of talk about what each of these sections is and why it matters, can be really helpful for ignoring the things that aren't relevant to the thing you're trying to solve right now.
Yeah, and this is not necessarily relevant to the performance dev tools, but just performance in general from a different angle. You also have, like I said, there's a lot you have to think about. And Ryan Florence has a really great topic that, or talk that he gave at, I think it was React Conf. I just dropped it into the chat for you, so you don't have to look it up. But it's called When to Fetch, and it has everything to do with data fetching as that relates to performance, and talks about data waterfalls and all the things that are probably slowing down your app more than rendering is. So especially if you're using a component-based system and you don't have, you're not using tools like either React Query or some framework that handles and optimizes fetching for you, this is a really great sort of lower level intro to how we should think about data fetching. And I think that's a huge, huge part of performance. So yeah, there's a lot of different angles, but if you really want to learn, like I said, the first step is just acknowledging and thinking about it and finding resources that dive into the topics, because it's really important that we get this right if we want to really make a better web.
Awesome. All right. Well, Chance, I think that's about all we have time for today. So let me drop another link to your Twitter. Let me drop another link to Front to Back. Anywhere else that people should go if they want to follow up either more on Million or more on you?
Come down to San Diego and hang out, and we'll talk all about it over some burgers and beer. That's about all I got, though, in the meantime.
All right. Well, thank you so much for hanging out. Y'all, this has been a ton of fun. And this episode, like every episode, has been live captioned. We've had Amanda from Whitecoat Captioning here with us all day. And that is made possible through the support of our sponsors. We've got Netlify, Vetsu Code, and brand new to the team, NX. Thank you so much. Make sure while you're checking out things on the site that you go and check out the schedule, because we've got a whole bunch of fun coming up. We are going to be learning about how, I don't know what Gen AI is. People keep saying that word, and I finally decided to ask. So Adam Cowley is going to come and teach me what it means, and we're going to set up and play with it. It's going to be a lot of fun. I've got other episodes that I forgot to put up on the site in time, so I will get those up soon. So keep your eyes peeled. And make sure you go check out the Learn with Jason YouTube as well, because we've got a lot more than just the live streams that we're on today. We've got a ton of fun stuff happening on there. So make sure you go and check that out. This one in particular was a whole lot of fun. I got a chance to film an interview here in Portland over lunch with Adam Argyle. He's a wonderful person. I learned a lot. I think you will too.
Love that guy.
Adam rules. So Chance, dude, thank you so much. This was so much fun. I really appreciate you taking the time, and hopefully next time we'll have you out here in person. We'll do our own version of burgers, but in Portland.
I love it. Portland's a great burger town. And also, don't forget to smash that like, smash that subscribe, keep this channel rolling, get those sponsors keep coming in, keep this man alive. Let's do this. Smash it.
Smash it. And remember, if you do join the channel, there are options for extended cuts, members only, behind the scenes, things like that. I'm trying to make this stuff work, y'all. I'm doing this as my full-time job, so any support is greatly appreciated. And with that, thank you all very much. Have a great weekend. We will see you all next time.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, Jason.